Hey y'all, it's your friendly neighborhood therapist, and I want to give y'all a really quick lesson in cognitive bias because we see it so much and all of us have it. So let's get into it. All right, so quick definition. Cognitive bias is a subconscious error in thinking, and it leads you to misinterpret information from the world around you and affects the rationality and accuracy of decisions and judgments. Biases are unconscious, usually, and automatic processes designed to make decision making quicker and more efficient. All right, y'all. So although all of us may want to believe that we are always rational and logical, we are not. The fact is we are continually under the influence of cognitive biases, and these biases are just distorted thinking. They influence beliefs and sway the decisions and judgments that we make each and every day. Sometimes they are fairly obvious, and often we can see them in others quicker than we can in ourselves, but a lot of times they're subtle and almost impossible to notice. So why do cognitive biases happen? Well, because attention is a limited resource. At the end of the day, most of us have very short attention spans. Let's just keep it real. But what this means is that we can't possibly evaluate every possible detail and event when forming thoughts and opinions. And because of this, we often rely on mental shortcuts that speed up our ability to make judgments, but sometimes lead to these biases. So now there are 10 types of cognitive biases that I want to go over real fast. So let's get into them. First up, confirmation bias, and this is the tendency to listen more often to information that confirms our existing beliefs. Through this bias, people tend to favor information that reinforces what they already believe or think. So if you only pay attention to information that confirms your beliefs about big issues such as like gun control, abortion, LGBTQ rights, etc., or you only follow people on social media who share your views, you only choose news sources that present stories that support your views, you refuse to listen to the opposing side, and you do not consider all of the facts in a logical and rational manner, well, then you are suffering from confirmation bias. The problem with this is that it can lead to poor choices and inability to listen to opposing views, and it contributes to othering people who hold different opinions. Next up is the hindsight bias, which is a common cognitive bias that involves the tendency to see events, even random ones, as more predictable than they are. So, for example, if you insist that you knew who was going to win a football game once the event is over, like you say, I knew they were going to win. That is a hindsight bias. Looking back on an exam and you think you knew the answers to the questions you missed, hindsight bias. So the effect of this is that it causes us to overestimate our ability to predict events, and it can sometimes lead people to take unwise risks. Next up is the anchoring bias, and it's a tendency for us to be overly influenced by the first piece of information that we hear. Prime example, the situation with Jonathan Majors. First piece of information dropped, people had their beliefs intact about what happened. Didn't have another piece of evidence, but they knew what happened. They picked a side off that first piece of information. So this also happens with doctors and mental health providers because we can become susceptible to anchoring bias when diagnosing patients. Our first impression of a patient or a client often creates an anchoring point that can sometimes incorrectly influence all subsequent diagnostic assessments. So this is where a lot of misdiagnosing comes from. An anchoring bias. Next up is the misinformation effect. And this is the tendency for memories to be heavily influenced by things that happened after the actual event itself. For example, a person who witnesses a car accident or crime might believe that their recollection is crystal clear, but research has shown over and over again that memory is surprisingly susceptible to even very subtle influences. So for example, you watch television coverage of an event and it may change how you actually remember that event. Or if you hear people talking about a memory from their perspective, it may change your memory of what transpired. And so there are a few factors that play a role in this, and new information may get blended with older memories, or in other cases, new information may be used to fill in gaps in your memory. The effects of this can range from trivial to much more serious. It might cause you to misremember something you thought happened at work, or misremember something your spouse or partner said. Or it might lead you to incorrectly identify a wrong suspect in a criminal case and now somebody going to prison that's innocent. Next up is the actor-observer bias, and this is a tendency to attribute our actions to external influences and other people's actions to internal ones. So for example, you go on a work trip and you botch an important meeting. You might say it's because you had jet lag. Or let's say you take an exam and you fail. You might say it's because the teacher put questions on there that weren't in the study guide, or she put tricky questions on there. But when it comes to other people with those same scenarios, it's their fault. So one of your colleagues botches a meeting and you'll say it's because they're lazy and incompetent, not because they also had jet lag. A fellow student bombs a test and you'll say it's because they lack diligence and intelligence and they didn't study enough. Not because the teacher put tricky questions on there, even though it was the same test. So perspective plays a key role in this particular bias. And the problem with it is that it often leads to misunderstandings. Each side of a situation is essentially blaming the other side rather than thinking about all the variables that might be at play. Next up is the false consensus effect, which is the tendency people have to overestimate how much other people agree with their own beliefs, behaviors, attitudes, and values. For example, thinking that other people share your opinions on controversial topics, overestimating the number of people who are similar to you, and believing that the majority of people share your preferences. False consensus effect happens for a variety of reasons, but one of the major reasons is we spend the most time with our family and friends, and they often do feel very similar in areas as we do with opinions and beliefs. And because of this, we start to think that this way of thinking is the majority opinion when it's not. It's just our people that think this. It's not everybody else. Another reason that this particular bias trips us up is because it's easy to believe that other people are just like us, and it's good for our self-esteem. It allows us to feel normal if we believe that people think just like us. But it can lead people not only to incorrectly think that everyone else agrees with them, but it can sometimes lead them to overvalue their own opinions. It also means that we sometimes don't consider how other people might feel when making choices. Next up, the halo effect. And this is the tendency for an initial impression of a person to influence what we think of them overall. This is also known as the physical attractiveness stereotype, or the what is beautiful is good principle. We are either influenced by or use the halo to influence others almost every day. For example, thinking people who are good looking are also smarter, kinder, and funnier than less attractive people, believing that products marketed by attractive people are more valuable, or thinking that a political candidate who is confident must also be intelligent and competent. We see where that got us. One factor that may influence the halo effect is our tendency to want to be right. Here we go again. What we think and what we believe is right. This always leads to problems. If our initial impression of someone was positive, we want to look for proof that our assessment was accurate. It also helps people avoid experiencing cognitive dissonance, which involves holding contradictory beliefs. This particular bias, the halo effect, can have a huge impact in the real world. For example, job applicants perceived as attractive and likable are also more likely to be viewed as competent, smart, and qualified for the job. And so an attractive person might get this job and they don't know what they're doing. Next is the self-serving bias, which is a tendency for people to give themselves credit for success, but lay the blame for their failures on outside causes. For example, when you get good grades, you attribute that to you being smart or studying hard, but when you get bad grades, it's because of the teacher. Or you believe your athletic performance is due to practice and hard work, but if you lose, it's because of something else, not because of you. Or you think you got a job because of your merits, but when you don't get the job, they were being discriminatory. Not that that can't be true. Just say it. You blame it on an outside cause when it really might not be that cause. The self-serving bias can be influenced by a variety of factors, and age and sex have been shown to play a major part. Older people are more likely to take credit for their successes, and men are more likely to pin their failures on outside forces. This bias does serve an important role in protecting our self-esteem. However, it can also lead to faulty attributions such as blaming others for our own shortcomings. Next up is the availability heuristic, which is a tendency to estimate the probability of something happening based on how many examples readily come to mind. For example, after seeing several news reports of car thefts in your neighborhood, you might start to believe that such crimes are more common than they are. Or you might believe that plane crashes are more common than they really are because you can easily think of several examples. It is essentially a mental shortcut designed to save us time when we are trying to determine risk. The problem with relying on this way of thinking is that it often leads to poor estimates and bad decisions. Last but not least, the optimism bias. And this is a tendency to overestimate the likelihood that good things will happen to us while underestimating the probability that negative events will impact our lives. Essentially, we tend to be too optimistic for our own good. So basically, the optimism bias is believing or assuming that negative events won't affect us, and it can lead us to take risks that we wouldn't normally take if we knew that there can be negative effects. The bad news is that research has found that the optimism bias is incredibly difficult to reduce, but the good news is that we do need optimism because we need hope and motivation. Just an additional cognitive bias that I think is super important, the status quo bias, which reflects a desire to keep things as they are. Lots of people fall into the status quo bias, and it is very problematic usually. All right, y'all, that's it for me. Which cognitive biases do you deal with? Y'all have a wonderful, beautiful rest of the day. See y'all later.